My name is John Silvester. I'm a reporter with the Age newspaper. Some people call me Sly of the Underworld. There are 5 million crime stories in the naked city, and this is one of them. Brian Coghlan is easygoing and laid back, an asset he was able to use in his workplace. As a prison officer, he quickly learned that being seen as a good guy around bad people was the key to life behind bars. For 26 years at Port Phillip Prison, he dealt with the worst society had to offer: sex offenders, serial killers, and manipulative mass murderers who knew they were destined to die in jail. He decided very early to deal with each inmate on the basis of how they behaved in jail, not what they did to get there. Today we have a chat to Brian and the tricks you need to survive in jail, both as an inmate and a prison officer. He also gives us a unique insight into some of the worst inmates inside Victorian prisons. We welcome Brian Coghlan. Brian, veteran of the now redundant Port Phillip Prison. You're in there for how many years? I may add as a prison officer, not as an inmate.
No, that's true. Started in 99, John, at the start of 99, and we wound up at the end of 25.
Well, Port Phillip would have been
26 years.
Port Phillip would have been still pretty young, wouldn't it?
It was about 18 months old, I suppose. I think it opened in late 97.
Yep.
98 they had terrible troubles.
There had been a big fire in one of the units.
Yes, Scarborough South burnt down, which was a bit of a design fault at the time, and it was poorly managed in the early days. All the managers were from England. They'd set it up as a bit of a Scandinavian type model with Christian names being used to the prisoners and, 3 staff to 60 or 70 prisoners. There was no batons. We didn't have anything to arm ourselves with, no gas and batons and things like that. In fact, the whole prison had no guns in it, no towers. The prisoners knew this and they could have literally taken it in 5 minutes' notice.
So, interesting career choice because you were a horse racing photographer.
I was, yeah, for 20 years. Yes, yeah. It was my grandfather's business initially, and my uncle took it over, and then I took it over.
So why become a prison officer?
Well, I wasn't too sure what I was going to do, to be honest. And then I was at a dinner party and ran into a bloke who was working out at Port Phillip. It had just opened, and as you do with people who work in prisons, you say, what was it like? And he said it was pretty chaotic. But he also said, I'm looking for someone to do some rep work, to get some work for the prisoners. He ran the industries part of Port Phillip. And he suggested I come over to be almost like a sales rep, to go out and try and get the prisoners work, that sort of thing. But that entailed doing all the training and having access to the prison. And when I was doing the training, it was actually fascinating and really enjoyed it and found it interesting. And then we'd go into the prison occasionally during the training to, watch the way things happened. And I must admit it fascinated me. And I told the manager that got me there that I might stay on the ground and see if I enjoy it and see what it's like behind here. And I loved it. Yeah.
Can you remember your first day? I imagine you would have been fairly, on tenterhooks.
My first day, I don't think I'll ever forget it because I was working with a guy who's still in the industry and he'd been out bouncing all night. So he was in a sick and sorry way, and basically there were 2 of us in the unit. I think there was 21 prisoners in the unit. It's only a small unit. And there were the 2 of us there. We'd unlocked them. He said, listen, don't give them anything or, don't tell them too much until I get back. He said, I've just got to duck into the office. Well, he came back at the lunchtime count. So I pretty much sat there for the first morning, all these prisoners coming up intrigued as to who I was, talking to them. And then my offsider came out and we did the count and got on with the rest of the day. But it was a pretty full-on unit at the time. There was some pretty heavy guys in there. It was a unit that was declared protection from protection, so these were quite high profile, most of them, and had to be kept away from other prisoners.
Now, so these are the prisoners who are the ones who are actually hated by other prisoners?
Pretty much, yeah.
So we're talking child molesters, we're talking mass murderers, and people who are just pricks inside.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. We had the Bega schoolgirl killers in there. We had Ray Edmunds, who was pretty much running the show. Peter Dupas.
We'll go to some of these people a bit later, but it's probably hard for people on the outside to understand how prison officers and often other prisoners deal with people not on what they've done, but how they behave inside. I mean, if you, because you spent a lot of time with the worst of the worst, they'd drive you mad if you kept thinking about what they did.
Oh, definitely. And people would often say, how can you work with these animals, basically, you know? And you just had to deal with them the way they dealt with you. As I said, with the opening of Port Phillip, they had a bit of a different mindset on the way to deal with prisoners. They didn't want any pentridge staff there. It was all, we had tennis courts and swimming pools, and it was like a holiday camp, I think. But having said that, when I ever got staff into my unit, I'd always say to them, this is an easy job. Just give them what they're entitled to. Don't play God with them, especially with their visits, their mail, anything that can aggravate them and they're entitled to, give it to them. Don't play games. Obviously, if they're not entitled to them, don't give it to them. Don't fall in. Don't be manipulated. I said, but in the big picture, we are the only people in the world that talk to these blokes with a modicum of respectability. We call them by their first name. We obviously don't, or you can't think about what they're in on, and, you'd end up jumping the counter yourself probably. But you just deal with them, and that would be reciprocated. They deal with us in a congenial way 90% of the time, and that's pretty much the way it sort of started.
So Port Phillip was a private prison, and there were still government prisons. So you got the most litigious because if a prisoner was going to sue it would sue the private company rather than the government. That was
pretty much the way it worked. If they were aggrieved about anything in the system, they had to go through the prison they were in, which was, as you say, a private prison. So we were forever in court, just dealing with trivial rubbish, matters that they'd raise and everything like that. And we soon worked out that we seemed to have all of the litigious prisoners at Port Phillip, especially in those early days. And you can't blame the government for doing that. They put a little buffer in between themselves, and because these guys were getting compensation for everything, they'd crack their head and get $60,000, and it was just ridiculous. But yeah, so that was one of the good things about having a private prison for the government, is it put that slight buffer between the prisoners and the state.
Now, it started, as you said, with a Scandinavian model, so it was very boys' school sort of thing. But it did toughen up along the way, and a few prisoners didn't want to go there.
Yeah, no. Soon after I started, they started bringing in ex-Pentridge staff, and I mean governors of Pentridge, big names at Pentridge. And they came over, and you could literally feel the place straightening up. It had
a lot of them were ex-military.
Yes, there were a few ex-military too, yeah. But names like Paul Spadano and Shane Kelly and Dennis Roach, and they were all big wigs in corrections, and they all came and worked for us, and they did straighten the place up a fair bit. But we were never the never the good guys in corrections. You know, CV didn't like us. Even our union didn't like us because we were working for a private firm and we wouldn't get all the things that the government workers would get. And anyway, but that was just more the politics of it all.
So what was the name of the division for the most protected?
The unit was called Sirius East.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sirius was a protection unit and Sirius East was an annex off that. And that was where we kept some of the more difficult and as you say, high profile prisoners in there.
The people who had to be protected, even from those who were being protected.
Mm.
So, yeah.
But we had some police in there. We had that Carlos Cabal, the international bank robber. He was fascinating. There are a lot of characters in there.
Tell us about Cabal.
Well, Carlos was obviously a very rich man.
Carlos Cabal is the man who, they say, broke the banks of Mexico.
It is no doubt the biggest white-collar story that Mexico has seen in the last 20 or 30 years.
The man from Tabasco, a local hero turned billionaire banker, turned international fugitive. How do you plead to these charges of fraud and embezzlement?
They are totally baseless and false charges.
The accountants of the day did a reconciliation of all his assets and things like that and brought them into the unit. And it was literally a foot high. And 6 inches of it was his own personal worth, which was around about 750 million US. And then they were alleging that he took 1.3 billion out of this bank. Now, his story to me was he owned the bank. And because he'd backed the wrong person in the presidential elections.
You had to try always to get along well with the people in power, yes.
Por la presidencia de México!
Cabal always did get along until this. The assassination of Luis Colosio, the candidate he supported to the tune of $15 million.
And then Carlos heard he was next and he got out of the country. Now, he told me he'd been through 16 countries and he set up as a grocer down in Brighton, delicatessen shop doing importing fine foods. And he ran that while his kids went to, Costco Hall and Xavier and everything like that. So, but when he got caught, or when they eventually caught up with him, he was amazing. He'd have visitors coming in from Mexico every week. So we'd always have to change. They used to only be allowed 10 visitors. Carlos was allowed 20. 10 people on their phones. Carlos was allowed 20. It was just, he would just sue them until they buckled, basically. And then that was how he got back into Mexico. He literally got every major law firm in Mexico City to do work for him, as in sue people, cross-sue, counter-sue, all of this sort of stuff. And then the government was trying to issue these rights to have him extradited back to Australia. There was no extradition between Mexico and Australia, so it was quite complicated. And they basically got the Dennis DeVenuto of legals over there to come over and serve him. And to cut a long story short, he went back there, he beat all the things, and he basically just pulled his head in and retired.
The general thought is that these really hard-end crooks can't reform. I was particularly interested in one, which a fellow called Dane Sweetman. Dane, neo-Nazi, crazy, when he was 20, on his birthday, back in 1991, he was sentenced to 15 years for the murder of a fellow called David Noble. And as I said, Sweetman was a Nazi and he'd held a party to celebrate Adolf Hitler's birthday. And at the party, he killed Noble, then cut his legs off before dumping the body. He threatened witnesses. He was so violent. He was covered in tattoos. He used to write to me. They weren't letters I was really fond of receiving, but nonetheless, there was lots of Nazi stuff there. But he did his time and he's disappeared. You knew him?
Yes, yeah. No, I remember Dane. He was there when I first walked in. And as I said, I treated them the way I found them. He was always polite and courteous and no trouble to us. But we did notice a real change in him halfway through his sentence. He fell out with the National Guard or the Front or whoever they were back then. And the letters that we used to see, because we checked their mail, see writing between them, threatening his family, threatening everything because he turned on them. And they were calling him a traitor and all this sort of stuff, that they detest. And, to his credit, he stuck by it. He did renounce them all and just wanted to get on with his own life. And, the government spent a fair bit of money on him because he had SWAT stickers all over his head. So they had them removed.
Yeah, tattoos.
Yeah.
They did a great big SWAT stickers.
Yeah, had big German things. His cell was full of Messerschmitts and Junkers and all these planes hanging from the cell, and we'd turn a blind eye to it because, as I said, he was no trouble to us. He wasn't into drugs. He wasn't, standing over anyone in the unit. So we just pretty much let him do his time. And it was interesting to watch him sort of rebirth himself, if you like. And to my knowledge, he's never been in trouble again. And as far as I know, he's not back in custody, but he was a bit of a success story. He was the one they had that film Romper Stomper based around, and that caused him a fair bit of grief in there because,
Russell Crowe effectively played that character.
Yeah. And, he went from being super violent to super nice guy.
Interesting. And, we've got to put it down to him.
Yeah, for sure.
He was the one who turned his life around.
He was seeing clinicians and that sort of thing to a degree, but he actually took the decision himself, as the way we read it, to really, when he told us he was denouncing and he was taking down all the German paraphernalia and all Nazi paraphernalia, really, it wasn't really German, but Nazi paraphernalia. And we just thought he might have been doing it to try and get parole or something like this, but this was well before he was due for parole. So, it must have been a conscious state of mind. And as I said, he fell out with them pretty hard. So
one that will never get out is Peter Dupass. He's doing time for 3 murders. He's a serial sex offender. He's been sentenced 3 times for murder, that of Nicole Patterson, Margaret Marr, and Messina Vargas. My knowledge of Dupass is that he was sort of, didn't appear to be particularly threatening. I know that when police interviewed him, they'd think they were getting to a point where he was going to talk, and then he'd close his eyes and they become vacant, as though he had some sort of panic room in the back of his head where he could hide, and he'd say, "Don't know what you're talking about." Well, you had to deal with him. What was he like?
He was one of the tougher ones to find a decent personality in, I must admit. He was always cold, very quiet. It was never any trouble to us or anything. He looked like an accountant, He wasn't a big tough guy or anything like that. So he wasn't hard to manage as such, but he was hard to place. A lot of prisoners obviously wanted to hurt him. He was a hard one to place. But the funny thing was, when Fraser said that Dupass confessed to him, we all just rolled our eyes and said,
"We'll get to Andrew." Andrew Fraser was a criminal lawyer. Police didn't like him because he ran with the crooks pretty good, and then he fell into cocaine addiction. Was finally charged over possession and trafficking cocaine, and was sentenced to a big term for what he'd done. He, in my view, should have been, a librarian in a prison, country prison, and teaching English. But somebody, a copper no doubt, put a report in that he was at risk. So it was designed, I think, to make his jail time really hard. And he palled up with Dupass. So there is a task force into the Messina Vargas murder. So we've got a reinvestigation, and everybody knows it was Dupass. The Director of Public Prosecutions Paul Coghlan actually started the inquest by saying, we think it's Dupas, but we don't have enough evidence. At this point, police contact Fraser, who's still inside, and say, you've spent some time with Dupas, you got anything to say? And Fraser said, what took you so long? And he made a statement that Dupas, while not verbally confessing, really mimed the whole crime, providing details which the police said were not publicly known. Fraser gave evidence. Dupas was convicted for a third time, and Andrew, who's now passed away, did get a fair bit of $1 million reward. That's what we know on the outside, but what was the view on the inside?
Well, on the inside, none of the, prisoners that had spent a lot of time with Dupas believed that he would have confessed. Like, they were he was their friends, and he'd never confessed to them. I said, well, maybe Fraser was doing some legal work for him or something along those lines, which was, what the story was. But we just rolled our eyes. We didn't believe a word of it. They thought that Fraser's mates in the law, because he'd been pretty much ruined by this whole thing, were putting on a bit of a benefit for him, for something when he gets out. None of them were in any doubt that Dupas had actually done it, but anyone who knew Dupas was thinking there's no way he would have confessed to Fraser or told him how he did it or anything like that. So that's where the suspicions arose there, or suspicions or whatever you want to call them. But that was one that, pretty much everyone in there just rolled their eyes and said, oh, well, he's a smart bloke. He's made this worth something at least to do this time.
Yep. Well, what we certainly know is Dupas did it, and he's doing time for it. So.
Yes. There's no doubt about that. But we all just looked at each other and thought, Dupas wasn't getting out anyway, and there's no way he's, going to nod to this. But it happened.
One of the most dangerous blokes, Greg Bluey Brazel. Brazel was the son of a Tasmanian police inspector, and he's always been bright. And I sort of didn't believe it at the time, but I do now, that he had a bike accident. He went over the top of his handlebars and hit his head, and the sort of front lobe that actually controls your self-discipline got pretty well fritzed. So he's gone from being the son of an inspector to a bloke who was convicted on 78 previous times. He put a knife to a prison officer and held him hostage. Been involved in over 25 violent assaults inside. Like he would sit there like with a tin cup or whatever banging on the bars for a day.
Days.
And all days.
Days.
3 murders, 2 women. He was under investigation for killing a woman, and it is generally believed he killed the second one purely because he wanted to do a sort of battle with the homicide squad to prove he was brighter. And then inside he confessed to a third murder, never getting out. And, he goes right back to the Chopper Reed days back in Pentridge, and he was part, with Jimmy Luffnan, of the crew that stabbed Chopper when they were members of the Overcoat Gang way back when. So he's there, he's in protection, and God,
he was in management. Sorry, he wasn't in protection. No, he was. But I've never seen him, or in all my time at Port Phillip when he was there, he was never out of Charlotte, which was the management unit. He wasn't free just to go out into the back units. He was a master manipulator of crooks. He would just drive them mad by calling them names, just saying the same thing day after day. As you said, tapping windows, tapping pipes to keep them awake, read out their visitors' addresses, and he'd make out, he was getting this information so the prisoners had turned on the staff thinking they're getting it for him and all of this sort of stuff, which they weren't, but he would manipulate them just by saying the same thing literally for hour after hour after hour until they literally smashed up their cell or broke or carried on or slashed up. He'd tell them to slash up, hang yourself, do all this sort of stuff. And it was just a game to him. He robbed one old bloke. He went into the hospital for some procedure and hooked up with an old bloke who was in on murder. That poor bloke, he ended up fleecing him for hundreds of thousands of dollars because he's a mad punter, Bluey. And he would just manipulate anybody he could get close to.
Yeah, look, and many years ago, of course, when there was more access to phones, he would ring police and he would have a chat to them, but he would always drop something in, like a street name, a Christian name of a child, a school, just to always say. And when he rang me, he was always so friendly and polite that there was this real undercurrent. He had years ago, he went on a hunger strike, and the people who love to look after prisoners on the outside, they're contacting us. He's near death. He hasn't eaten for 28 days. And I actually asked someone, can you get his weight? And I think he was 178 centimetres and I think 83 or 85 kilos, which was basically Lee Matthews' height and weight. Yeah. So he wasn't, he wasn't fading away to a shadow. No. Then they found hidden in his bunk, a truckload of Mars bars. So he was more likely to die of acne than starvation.
Exactly, yeah. Some of them are so funny, and so like Hugo. Hugo was brilliant. Hugo, they used to try and hide phones. They'd have phones snuck in or got them in. And Bluey you'd be searching his cell and he'd be going cold, cold, cold. And just literally, they'd have them stooped up toilets in air bubbles and just everywhere. But Hugo had a desk. He used to work down at the woodwork area, and his woodwork was pretty good, to be fair. But he designed this desk that looked only to be about an inch thick, and it was all beautifully polished teak or something. It looked terrific. And then he's putting on the metal legs to it, and it was all good, and that was going to sit in his cell. Until one day the desk rang. It had a secluded part where there was a mobile phone in it, and he either had forgotten to turn it off or down or whatever, but we couldn't even get the phone out of the desk. It slid in, it was put together that well, and it was literally in an inch. This is when phones were like bricks. It seemed to be in like an inch thick desk, with charges and everything like that, all routed out.
Hugo, what an absolute waste. It was. He could have been a star on the outside. He was so bright. He actually faked his way in as a stockbroker when he was out. And what was his company? Triple B, Bullshit Baffles Brains. It is said he took the name Hugo from Hugo Boss Suits. When he did armed robberies, he wore a silk balaclava, designer
balaclava.
And then he killed a poor security guard, Kastenberg, out at Blackburn North, and the bloke had given him the money, and there was no need to do it, but a security guard had given him up on a previous job or been a witness, so he killed him in cold blood.
Well, when he came in on that, he hadn't been out for long.
Yeah.
And, like maybe a month, or it seemed like, geez, you're back quickly. And then he said, can you believe it, Brian? They're putting me down as a cold-blooded murderer. Just outrageous. I'm a bank robber. I don't do this sort of stuff. And anyway, and I remember saying to him, Hugo, the only thing that'd be funnier is if you actually didn't do it and you went down on it. Well, he didn't think that was funny. He said, no, that's ridiculous. There's no way. Well, I think 2 prisoners gave evidence against him, and they were at Port Phillip too, so we had to keep them apart. And then eventually he was moved down to Barwon because it was just getting too hot for him at Port Phillip.
Yeah, well, he delayed and delayed and delayed one of his cases, and when the judge was going to arraign the jury, did he flip out? And he's just going, I'm just a bit stressed in prison, so if I could just get bail and possibly have a little holiday, I'll just get my mind right and then we can go ahead. And, of course, he absolutely flipped out in the court, which was videoed, luckily. This is the time we come calling for your reviews. The good ones will be acknowledged, and the bad ones we will ignore because they are the height of treachery. Like this one on Apple. I am enthusiastic and impatient for the next episode. A very Moorish podcast. Thank you, Bert79, although the only Moor I know is a swampy one in foggy Yorkshire. Or this one on Spotify from La-di-da on our episode about Anne Hooker and youth justice. What an inspirational woman. Thank you for being a positive influence in these young lives. Needless to say, we agree, but just remember, we were the ones who found her in the first place. Another one of great notoriety, Julian Knight. Knight, of course, was the Hoddle Street killer back in 87. He fired about 200 rounds. He killed 7 people and wounded 19 and shot the police helicopter, and he was only 19, so he's been in ever since. Really smart. Again, absolutely manipulative. Now, you would think someone like that would have to be in protection for the rest of his time. What was he like?
Well, he was initially in protection, and to be fair to Julian, he's the only prisoner I can think of that's made it out of Sirius East, which was like the worst of the worst, to the mainstream. And I must admit, I thought somebody out there is gonna have a crack at him, you know. But with his skills, with his legal skills, he quickly worked out, well, he would have had it already teed up, who he was going to help out there, and then they'd hold the troops off, so to speak. And he would work on their legal issues, and he would be basically granted protection because he's not a big guy. You know, he's probably the fittest guy at Port Phillip. They used to do beep tests and he'd win that every year. But, he wasn't a big sort of bloke. Now he describes himself as a 19-year-old having a bad day, never been in trouble, blah, blah, blah. And I said to him when he was coming up to his bottom, which was, I think, 28 years. And I said, are you applying for parole? And he goes, no, there's no way I'll get it. And I said, oh, okay. He said, no, I'm going to do another 5 and then I'm going to apply. Now, he was a model prisoner, as in no, apart from being very litigious to the government, to staff and everything like that, he wasn't an issue. He was polite. He was compliant. He was not an issue. But he dug his own grave with all that thing because they eventually brought in the, one-person rule, basically, or one...
Basically that he'd never... Retrospectively, that he would never get out.
He planned to take him to The Hague and everything. Like, he had it all... I saw the literature.
I mean, I got no time for Knight. However, he's got a case. I don't think there should have been retrospective legislation.
No.
He could go for parole and the parole board could say, we don't think you're ready because the top end was life.
The top end was life, exactly. I don't know why all they had to do was knock him back at parole. Having said that, he would have challenged it, obviously.
Well, he was challenging them because, and a lot of his stuff was total crap, but again, this had an element of truth in it. He was saying, you're not letting me do any of the pre-parole courses because you want me to fail. Let me do the courses. And if I fail, I fail. So he had grounds there.
He did. He used to say to me he was the only person who's still alive that was 19 when he committed the crime, had never been in jail before, obviously, was still in maximum security and was rated as a model prisoner. Now, his argument to me was, that's wrong. Like, that's in the world. Now, I said, but Julian, they would have been put to death most places in the world. So,
I mean, if he did it now, he'd get life no minimum. And it was just interesting because we think sentencing today is softer. There wasn't a big hue and cry about it at that time because we wrote it. He got life, and there was one copper and the bloke who interviewed him, Graham Squirty Kent, who said, this is not right. He's got 27. You don't want him out. But, the Crown could have appealed and they didn't.
And they didn't, that's right. And I'm a bit with you. I'm not mad on retrospective laws, full stop.
Ray, Mr. Stinky Edmunds, you sort of mentioned him before, serial rapist and double killer.
If you woke to see Raymond Edmunds, you'd pray it was a bad dream.
Today, the killer, known as Mr. Stinky for his foul body odour, confessed to ruining more lives.
His son had seen what was happening on the night of the attack and said he was too scared to help. He was only 8.
The predator stalked, assaulted or raped young women 9 times in the 70s and 80s. He'd already murdered 2 teens.
He served over 40 years. 86, he was convicted for the murders of Gary Hayward and Abina Medill in Shepparton, and that was way back in the 60s. The crime happened.
60s, yeah.
And it was effectively when someone recognised the fingerprint that nailed him. So he went in as a piece of vermin, and yet in the end, and he's nearly 80, isn't he?
He would be. He'd have to be close to 80, if not in his early 80s. And he was at Port Phillip every day that I was there, like as in he never went to another jail. He didn't go anywhere else. He manipulated his placement. Like he wouldn't talk to the sentence management people who would determine where they go. And for years, he just wouldn't attend. They'd have their yearly, and you'd say, Ray, you're going to go up and tell them, no, I've got natural life. What's the point? I'm happy here. I'm going to stay here. And then when they did try to move him a couple of times, he'd contact Intel or something like that and say, I want to speak to the police about another matter. So they'd keep him at Port Phillip, and then, I don't know if he'd be charged with anything else or anything, but he was just manipulating his placement. But having said that, he was like having a 5th officer in the unit he went to. He pretty much ran the unit. Even when he was in his 80s, he'd just sit by the front door of the unit, and guys would come up and get their rations or get whatever. He was very fair with everyone. And I presume that's why he sort of lasted in there. He's obviously institutionalized. This was his life. He, rarely got visits, spoke to his family quite often, but apart from that, this was his life. So if we needed anything in the jail, if you needed a bed pack or toiletries or blankets or a TV, and you'd ring this, our suppliers, and they'd say, no, we're out. We haven't got anything. Well, you'd ring Ray Edmunds' unit, and then you'd say, who is it? And you'd say, oh, it's Brian. All right. Return it to me in the next few days, and you'd never return it, but he'd never say anything, and he'd just keep supplying things. You'd go and say, righto, Ray, we need a TV, mate, or a TV remote. Okay, who's it for? And you tell him, and he'd go, oh, okay. Now, this guy you knew was going to smash it, was going to shit on it, was going to break it, was going to do everything, but if he's entitled to it, you'd give it to him, and then and then Raymond goes, where's my TV that I gave you a couple of days ago? And you just laugh and go, oh, I'll get one from stores for you or something like that. But you wouldn't, and he'd never hassle you. We were like his extended family, if that makes sense. Because we were pretty much the only people in the world who would call him Ray or ask him, just talk to him like a normal human being.
Well, one of these blokes I met, and it was sort of surreal, is Paul Stephen Haig. He's done 47 years. He went in 79. He was only 21, and that was for 6 murders, including a little boy. And I was talking to him, and face to face, and it was so matter of fact. He was just talking about these things. And then he killed a 7th inside, and the general view is he didn't want Julian Knight to have killed more. And
that's what we used to ask him.
So what was he like?
He was crazy, Paul, or probably still is. I haven't seen him for a while. He was another one that was pretty much never going to get out. But he used to, every 5 years, the parole board would review him. So about a year before he was coming up for parole, he went from his short crew cut, normal cut to looking like something out of Monty Python, the Life of Brian with the guys on the wall, like with the long shaggy hair and, I've been here 100 years. And he would, and I'd say, what are you doing? He goes, I want to look as old as possible, but he was crazy. He'd go into his cell and he'd have like crucifixes hung upside down with blood oozing down the wall. And, everything about him was a little bit weird.
Well, his last trial for the one he assisted hanging, he held onto the legs of a guy.
Yeah, so he did him a favour.
He wanted to go to court dressed as the Grim Reaper.
I believe it.
It's they wouldn't let him do it.
No, he was. He's one you would just never let out. He is completely batshit crazy.
Roy Pollitt. The Red Rat.
Yes, Roy was a bit of a character.
Armed robber escaped from New South Wales twice, was down here, did a professional hit, was supposed to kill a drug dealer called Alan Williams. Williams was warned, and so when Dennis Allen and Pollitt went to Williams' house, bloody Williams' brother-in-law, Lindsay Simpson, was there. And they shot him in front of his child. I spoke to Pollitt about it, and he said, it wasn't me. It was always considered a mistaken identity murder. But when I asked him, he said, that wasn't me. But I can reliably inform you it wasn't. It wasn't mistaken identity. The killers were not wearing balaclavas and would have been recognised. So they had to do it. Well, clearly Pollitt was saying it was me.
Yeah.
And I didn't get the wrong person, but he was a thing. What was he like?
He was a pretty violent dude early doors. I can remember one day there'd been a stabbing in one of the units, and the word came up to us that get ready to expect Pollitt. He's coming up the corridor, They were locking down the prison so we could make the move. And I'd stepped out of my office, and the governor was there, the head of the security group was there, a guy called Paul Spadano, who had a very funny turn of phrase usually. And he was like an old English major and a general with a little moustache and everything bar the little cane that they used to carry. He'd always look immaculate and everything like that. And he stuck his head out of the office and said, who's this? Who are they bringing up? And I said, it's Roy Pollitt. He goes, oh. So he stood there with me and we're waiting. And as the boys dragged him past us, Spadano told him to stop and said, who have you got there? And they said, it's Roy. And Pollitt's going, it's Roy, you dog, Spadano and all this sort of stuff. He goes, well, what's going on, Roy? What's happening down there? And he goes, they reckon I've stabbed someone in the unit and blah, blah, blah. And he said, but it's all wrong, Mr. Spadano. They've grabbed the wrong bloke and this is just a fit up and you blokes are all part of it and all this sort of stuff. And Spadano just turns around and goes, shame is, Roy, red hair, no friends. Off you go. And the boys dragged him down to Charlotte and we just laughed and just thought that was so weird. But he was actually quite a good artist. He did a fair bit of prison art in there and I think he got deported in the end. He did he? Yeah.
He was English.
He was English, yeah. Well, quite a few of them have been sent back and they'd been here since they were like 2 and 3 years old.
Les Camilleri, one of the worst, sentenced to life with no minimum for the 1997 murders of the Bega schoolgirls, Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins. And then later he pleaded guilty to the 1992 abduction and murder of Glenroy's schoolgirl, Prue Bird. I'm not going to even bother going into the details of Vega because it's so horrendous. Yeah. But you had to deal with someone like him.
I did, yes. I had them both in my unit, Lindsay and
Lindsay Beckett.
Lindsay Beckett and Les Camilleri initially, and then during their trial, Lindsay started giving evidence against Camilleri. And so we had to separate them and keep them apart. But Lindsay was just a goose, it's like the cartoon with that little whippet just walking around. Hey, Butch, that sort of thing. He was just and he actually admitted that he killed those 2 girls in Bega But he said Camilleri was standing right over him, basically saying, if you don't do it, I'm going to kill you too. And yeah, he was just dumb, just a dumb kid.
What was Camilleri like?
He wasn't much smarter, to be fair, but I think he was from Yass or Canberra, up that way.
Yeah.
And he was running amok up there, and he was a big boy, and I think he was being wanted for a couple of rapes up there, and then he did what they did at Bega, and we ended up with him. Yeah, he's no good. He tried to kill himself quite a few times.
What was the pity?
He tried to kill Mr. Stinky. He tried to kill Ray Edmunds. And Ray actually got wind of it because he was poisoning his food, slowly trying to poison his food. And they got wind of it for a while, and we watched it happen. And after a while, obviously Ray wasn't eating the food, and Les was wondering why he wasn't falling over. And then we had to separate them.
Do you remember what poison he was using?
I don't. But Ray was far too smart for that. He got onto it that early. He used to check all our food and stuff and anything the prisoners would eat because they were in the protection unit, and the meals were made by Mainstream. Quite often he'd come to me and say, these meals have been tampered with. And I'd look at him and couldn't see anything wrong. And he goes, I'm just telling you they have been. So I'd go back to the kitchen or take a prisoner to get them back to the kitchen, and then in front of everyone, pull our trolley aside, pull the boxes out, put them in the Pennine or the Waxen Bid trolley, which was where all the people who worked in the kitchen lived, and grab their trays, and the looks on their faces because those meals had been tampered with, and now they had to send it down to their units, so he was quite smart, very jail smart, with that sort of thing.
Remember Justice Frank Vincent, who did the Vega case, he said that when Beckett gave evidence about what had happened, he sort of delivered it in a monotone, and it was so horrible it still lives with Frank, because he said one of the victims' mothers was wailing, hearing what had happened, and he said that the wailing was not even human. It was guttural. She was so devastated by what those two had done. The prison's changed. We got the Human Rights Charter. Port Phillip's closed down, but you were saying it becomes very, very difficult to try and manage people because the authority of prison officers is eroded.
Well, just especially over the last few years, it's just becoming ridiculous. You can't assault prisoners, and that's a taken, and none of us really want to. And I'm not a heavy or a hard guy or anything like that, but you used to be able to ask prisoners to move cells, and they'd move cells. You'd ask prisoners to bunk in together, and you'd say, listen, it's only for a short while, we're running short of beds, and they'd do it. Like, they didn't have a lot of choice, but they'd do it. Then it got to a stage where we were instructed we're not allowed to touch them, like literally not even hand on the back, move through there. We weren't allowed to do anything nearly without being touched first or being assaulted. So we had staff getting shit bombed, with people just walking up and tipping a whole bucket of shit over them, basically. That happened a few times, and, we just felt like you can't do anything, because in the thing you could read when something was going to happen, and you'd literally stand up, get between them, push one into a cell and say, you move over there, you go over there. Well, you can't do that. You can't get involved. So it did. It made corrections become very, very hard, because when you'd complain to your boss, or the bosses were that sick of being told off by Corrections Victoria they'd say, leave him there. It's just a bum on a chair, basically. So if he's secured, leave him there. which sort of made sense, but it'd drive the prisoners nuts. They're all separated from each other. I was having lunch with a guy the other day who works at the MAP. They had 70 separated prisoners. Now, they've only got about 200 or 300 in there, and they haven't got the room, but now everyone's got to be separated from each other, and it's just...
Well, that's Melbourne Assessment.
Yeah, that's
prison.
The Melbourne Assessment Prison.
And it's kicking off there, I understand. We're absolutely kicking off.
Oh, mate, that's right. You know, the prisoners know that they get in your face, they tell you to fuck off. You still can't do anything about it. They tell you to, you know, what they're going to do to your family. You still can't do anything about it. So you just have to sort of grin and bear it to a degree, and then, you know, hopefully they'd calm down. That was what I think Corrections Victoria think it'll happen. We'll deal with them at another stage when they'll be a little bit more compliant. Well, I'm sorry, the system doesn't work that way. You know, like, we've got prisoners locked up in police cells everywhere that can't get into the jails because prisoners don't want to see shells, basically. Yet they closed Port Phillip, 1,600 bed jail, purely for, political reasons, really. And
what about the new prison, the giant Western Plains or whatever the thing's called?
Yeah, it's huge. It's been open probably over a year now. Still, they've got units that are closed because they can't staff them. Yet all the Port Phillip staff, especially the senior staff, we've been made redundant. And, it's just ridiculous. So hence, that's why I'm out and having a chat about it and doing these talks and
that's a point, Brian, that you are giving sort of, I don't know if it's after dinner speeches, but you're giving public talks about the real inside of what happens behind the walls.
Behind the walls, which, any person who works in a prison will tell you. You go to a dinner party or you're at a pub and they find out you're a screw. They want to know about this. Have you got so-and-so? Did you have so-and-so? Have you met him? What's he like? Or, can you give him a smack in the mouth for me or something along those lines? There's always a story.
Well, if there's anyone out in podcast land who wants the real insight into what happens behind the walls and about some of these pretty nasty people, contact me via email and I'll pass it on to you, Brian.
Appreciate that, John. Appreciate the time.
Good on you. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, mate. Thank you.
This episode was produced by Tammy Mills and mixed by Cormac Lully. Our podcasts are overseen by Lisa Muxworthy and Tom McKendrick. The sun is about 400 times larger than the moon, and the average person blinks 14 to 17 times per minute. Unless you're a serial killer. I've met some of those. Some are in this newsroom. And remember, there is a touch of evil in all of us.
So, until we meet again, this is Anthony Quayle reminding you that there is a touch of evil in all of us. Good night.